Welcome. Today, we're going to deconstruct two ECGs that at first glance might look incredibly complex, maybe even impenetrable. But what we're going to demonstrate is how a rigorous, step-by-step, logical approach can transform what seems like a confusing tracing into a very precise diagnosis, one that really matters for the patient.
So here's our game plan. We'll kick things off with the foundational principles of ECG interpretation. Then we'll apply those principles to two really fascinating cases. First, we'll do a deep dive into a complex junctional rhythm. After that, we'll see how a single short strip can tell an entire clinical story. And we'll wrap it all up by reviewing the key takeaways you can apply in your own practice. All right, let's jump right in. Before we get to the cases themselves, we have to build a solid foundation. This first section is all about creating a reliable, systematic framework for approaching any challenging arrhythmia with confidence. So you're looking at a tracing that seems totally chaotic. How do you even begin? Well, the key isn't just about spotting patterns. It's really about having a system, a deductive process that lets you break down the ECG into smaller, much more manageable electrophysiological parts. Here's our first case. And yeah, I get it. At first glance, it looks like a mess. A jumble of regular and irregular beats, shifting P-wave morphologies. It's tempting to just give up. But trust me, there is a perfectly logical and frankly elegant sequence of events hidden right here in this tracing.
Our approach is pretty straightforward and has three key steps. First up, we look at the QRS complexes. Are they narrow or wide? Here, they're all narrow, which points us to a supraventricular origin. Second, we go on a hunt for P-waves, and this is crucial. We have to figure out their direction. Are they anterograde, conducting forward from the sinus node, or are they retrograde, conducting backward from the AV junction? And finally, the most important step, we focus our analysis on any breaks in the rhythm. That's always where you'll find the highest yield diagnostic clues.
Okay, now for the fun part. Let's apply these principles to our first case. We're going to proceed with a really meticulous, beat-by-beat examination to uncover what's truly going on with the underlying electrophysiology. This is a golden rule of ECG interpretation. Whenever you see a change in a rhythm, in a regularity, that is your starting point. It's not some random event. It's the key that's going to unlock the entire mechanism of the arrhythmia.
So, following our rule, we're starting our analysis right at the arrow, at beat 1. This QRS is narrow, but look closely, there is no P-wave right before it. That morphology defines it as a junctional beat. It means the impulse is coming from the AV junction, not the sinus node. The P-wave is still happening, it's just occurring at the same time as the QRS, so it's effectively buried inside it.
Now look at beats 1 through 5. They're all marching along quite regularly at a rate of 125 beats per minute. Now the intrinsic rate of the AV junction is usually only about 40 to 60. So when a junctional focus starts firing this fast, say between 100 and 150 per minute, we call it an accelerated junctional rhythm. And that is the primary underlying rhythm that we're dealing with here. And here's where it gets really interesting. Do you see that upright P wave that emerges just after beat 2? That's a sinus P wave. Its appearance, completely independent of the QRS complexes, confirms that the atria and the ventricles are being driven by two separate pacemakers. This phenomenon is called AV dissociation. We can even measure the P to P interval, which tells us the sinus rate is 107, just a little bit slower than the junctional rate.
Okay, now I want you to shift your focus to the inverted P waves following beats 3, 4, and 5. These are retrograde P waves. The impulse from the junction is traveling backward up into the atria. But notice the timing. The interval from the R wave to that P wave gets progressively longer with each beat. This is the classic signature of Winkelbach conduction, a progressive delay until a beat is dropped. But here it's happening in reverse, from ventricle to atrium. This is just a beautiful example of a retrograde VA Winkelbach phenomenon.
And this is the climax of the story. That retrograde impulse from beat 5 is delayed just long enough in the atria that by the time it gets back down to the AV junction, the junction has recovered and is ready to go again. So the impulse effectively turns around and conducts right back down to the ventricles, creating beat 6. This is a classic reentrant beat, what we call an echo beat. And that event then resets the junctional pacemaker, and this whole complex cycle just starts all over again. So we've dissected the entire elegant mechanism. Now let's put it all together into a final diagnosis and, maybe most importantly, talk about what this actually means for the patient.
The primary diagnosis here is accelerated junctional rhythm. It is absolutely critical to understand this. Everything else we saw,
the AV dissociation, the retrograde Wenckebach, the echo beats. All of those things are just fascinating downstream electrophysiological consequences of this single underlying rhythm.
So why is this diagnosis so important? Well, because an accelerated junctional rhythm immediately points to one of three very specific clinical situations: digitalis toxicity, myocardial ischemia, or a state of excess circulating catecholamines, like a surge of adrenaline. And this particular patient was recovering from aortic root surgery, which is a massive physiological stressor. This points us directly to that third cause. Seeing this on a monitor should trigger an urgent clinical workup for these three possibilities.
That was a fantastic example of how a systematic approach can unravel a complex mechanism. Now let's look at another case that shows how even a very short rhythm strip can tell a complete clinical story, right down to the underlying systemic disease.
This is our second case. You can see it's just a short strip, but it contains every clue we need to not only diagnose the arrhythmia, but also to deduce the non-cardiac medical condition that's causing it. Let's break this down systematically. We have 4 key observations. 1. The QRS is narrow, so we know it's a supraventricular origin. 2. The average ventricular rate is extremely fast, around 200 beats per minute. 3. The QRS complexes are grouped in pairs, a pattern we call ventricular big Gemini. And 4, and this is the crucial clue, the longer RR interval is less than twice the shorter RR interval. That specific mathematical relationship is a telltale sign of a Wenckebach-type conduction block.
Okay, now let's connect the dots. What did these very precise ECG findings tell us about what's happening inside this patient's body to cause a rhythm like this?
Those paired beats at a ventricular rate of 200 give us a huge mathematical clue. This pattern strongly suggests a 3-to-2 AV conduction block. That means for every 3 atrial impulses, 2 are getting through to the ventricles. Well, basic math tells us that if 2/3 of the atrial rate is 200, the underlying atrial rate must be exactly 300.
A regular atrial rhythm, firing away at a rate of 300 beats per minute, is pathognomonic for one arrhythmia. Pathognomonic is a great word. It means its presence definitively identifies a particular condition. And in this case, that condition is atrial flutter. As you can see from this chart, no other regular supraventricular tachycardia typically operates at this specific atrial rate. So, the final diagnosis is atrial flutter with 3-to-2 AV Wenckebach conduction. But there's one more piece to this puzzle. The AV node has a natural speed limit. It usually cannot conduct this fast. Something must be causing what we call facilitated AV conduction. And the most common cause for this is an overactive thyroid gland. Sure enough, this patient was diagnosed with severe hyperthyroidism, or thyrotoxicosis. Okay, let's wrap up by just briefly reviewing the core diagnostic principles that we use to systematically solve both of these complex cases.
Here is a very high-yield takeaway from our first case. When you see a premature beat during AV dissociation, you have to be able to tell the difference between a capture beat and an echo beat. They both shorten the RR interval, but the P wave tells the entire story. An upright P wave means it's an anterograde sinus capture beat. An inverted P wave means it's a retrograde junctional echo beat. It's a really critical distinction. We'll leave you with this thought. These 2 cases are a brilliant demonstration that an electrocardiogram is so much more than just a tracing of electrical activity. It is a rich clinical narrative. And if you have a systematic, principle-based approach, you can learn to read that story and use it to make a real, definitive difference for your patients.